There are evenings in Oxford when even the weather seems hesitant to intrude. That night, the city waited beneath a slow-falling hush, the sort of cold that stilled everything except the faint hiss of tires on damp roads and the occasional sigh of wind over stone. Snow was promised, though not yet certain. A forecast whispered by men on radios who sounded as though they'd rather be indoors. I remember thinking how perfectly the season suited the college quads, symmetrical, grave, and unreasonably dignified in their decay. I had been sitting alone in a small cafe off Broad Street, the kind of place that survives not on food but on familiarity. The lamps along the wall trembled with low yellow light, and the window had fogged so entirely that the world beyond it appeared erased. There was a radio murmuring back beneath the clatter of teaspoons. I was halfway through a tepid cup of coffee and the crossword in the Times, where 6 across had defeated me. Unfaithful likeness conceals one's true reflection. 8. I had penciled portrait, then crossed it out again. There was something too obvious about it, too neat. Across from me, 2 men were speaking in the subdued tones of academia, the language of certainty feigned and rivalry disguised. One was lamenting a cancelled exhibition at St. Cuthbert's College. The other replied that such things often happened when curators get too close to their subjects. I only caught fragments, a missing painting, a Don gone peculiar, and once the faintly amused phrase, the portrait that lied. I folded the paper then, not out of curiosity, but out of habit, because some phrases tend to echo longer than they should. Outside, Broad Street was already sheened with frost. I walked slowly toward the bus stop, the city breathing faintly in the cold. The bell of St. Mary's struck 9, its tone oddly muffled, as though the air itself had thickened. I thought of the word portrait again, and how it had seemed almost to mock me from the crossword clue. Unfaithful likeness. True reflection. The words refused to leave. The next morning I woke to the soft whiteness of snow on my windowsill and the smell of stale tobacco in the room. I'd fallen asleep in the armchair again, still half-dressed. The kettle took an age to boil. Outside, the city had been transformed into a sketch done entirely in shades of silence. The post arrived with its usual small indignities. Bills, a charity appeal, and a copy of the Oxford Mail folded neatly to the crime section. The headline was brief, almost indifferent. College art historian found dead at St. Cuthbert's. The piece itself was sparse, factual to the point of cruelty. Dr. Leonard Bracknell, 58, lecturer in art history, discovered in his rooms late last night. Apparent accident. No foul play suspected. I read it twice, not because I knew the man, but because I had overheard his name the previous evening, tangled among the cafe murmurs. Coincidence, perhaps. Yet Oxford rarely deals in coincidences. It prefers ironies. Lewis called that afternoon, his voice half lost in the static of the line. There had been a request from the coroner's office for a police inquiry. A formality, nothing more. The college, he said, wanted it handled discreetly. I asked if they had a motive for discretion. He chuckled in that uneasy way of his and said, "They've got donors to impress, sir." By the time I reached St. Cuthbert's, the daylight had already begun to drain away. Snow fell steadily now, erasing footprints as they formed. The porter nodded me through with the weary courtesy of someone who'd already given too many statements. I remember the corridors, narrow, panelled in oak, their air heavy with polish and the ghost of Latin declensions. Somewhere a radiator hissed unevenly. Dr. Bracknell's rooms were small but orderly, with that peculiar neatness that hints at loneliness. A bottle of claret stood uncorked beside a single glass, still half full. There was no sign of struggle. Only a faint scent of linseed oil, the kind used by painters, and a scattering of white pigment dusting the carpet near his desk. I bent down and pressed a finger into it. Cold. Fine. fresh. Lewis said he'd slipped on the stairs, hit his head, died instantly. I nodded, but my eyes were on the painting above the mantel. An oval portrait of a woman in muted tones, her gaze strangely alive against the dimness of the room. The plaque beneath read, Lady Agnes Valeri, 1763. The light from the window fell unevenly across her face, catching the edge of her mouth in a way that made it seem as though she might speak if left long enough in silence. Something about her expression unsettled me. Perhaps it was the faint asymmetry of the eyes, or the way the varnish caught the lamplight, as if layers had been added years apart. I found myself thinking again of that crossword clue and of the word that didn't quite fit. Unfaithful likeness conceals one's true reflection. That night, walking back through the snow-laden streets, I wondered whether every portrait, painted or otherwise, contained a lie so carefully crafted that only time could expose it. I told myself it was just another Oxford death, accidental, unremarkable. But the wind that drifted along the high street carried with it a strange insistence, like the whisper of a brushstroke made by an unsteady hand. And though I would not admit it then, I already knew that the stillness before snow is rarely still at all. The snow had deepened by the time I returned to St. Cuthbert's. It fell in that curious Oxford way, soundless, measured, as if even the weather observed academic decorum. Sunt, the porter, a man whose moustache seemed to predate the modern police force, led us through the side entrance to avoid disturbing the gentleman of high table. His keys jingled like distant chimes in the corridor's hush. I remember thinking that the college smelled of both sanctity and dust, a mixture peculiar to old institutions and older secrets. Lewis followed behind me, his breath visible, his notebook damp at the corners. He had that look of good-natured disbelief he always wore when the world insisted on being stranger than procedure allowed. We were shown to Bracknell's rooms again, now stripped of the immediacy of death. A faintly antiseptic smell hung over the air where tragedy had already been tidied away. I looked about, not at the body, which was gone, but at what remained. On the mantel, the portrait dominated the space, the woman in muted tones, framed in tarnished gold, eyes fixed somewhere beyond us. Lady Agnes Valeri. I had seen her face once before, in a college calendar, perhaps, but something about it here was altered. Not in the composition itself, but in its presence. Paintings, I've learned, either invite or accuse. This one seemed to do both. Lewis was speaking. Some question about the stairs, the banister, the plausibility of slipping. I heard only half of it. My attention had drifted to the small misalignment of the frame. It hung slightly off-center, as if moved and hastily rehung. Beneath it, the faint trace of a cleaner patch on the wall. Rectangular, smaller. Another picture had once been there. The bursar appeared then, a brisk, tweed-clad man whose manner combined grief and irritation in equal parts. He repeated the official account. Bracknell had worked late, likely gone to fetch a reference book, slipped on the icy steps. The bottle of claret, he added, was unopened. He seemed pleased with that detail, as though sobriety might restore dignity to the dead. I asked who last saw Bracknell alive. The bursar hesitated. Dr. Clare, he said. Evelyn Clare, of Modern Languages. She'd been working with him on a paper concerning restoration ethics. I caught Lewis's glance. He'd heard the same name yesterday from the librarian. The bursar noticed my gaze on the portrait. It was one of Bracknell's favorites, he said. He'd written a small article about it for the Journal of British Art History some years ago, claimed it was misattributed, said the lady's smile was more modern than Georgian. I asked who restored it. The bursar frowned, uncertain. Bracknell himself, perhaps. He dabbled, though the college preferred professional hands. There was a pause then. the sort of silence that grows dense with things unspoken. A clock somewhere struck the half-hour. I imagined the man dead at the foot of the stairs, the sound of that same clock marking the indifferent passage of time. Lewis cleared his throat and mentioned the faint, white residue we'd found near the desk. The bursar said it was plaster dust. I said I thought not. Plaster crumbles coarser, less uniform. This had the fine, greasy texture of pigment, possibly zinc white, common in later restorations. He looked at me blankly, as if the distinction were a personal affront. When he left, I examined the portrait more closely. A brush stroke revealed itself under the lamplight. Too modern, too fluid for an 18th century hand. The varnish carried that faint amber sheen one sees only in retouched surfaces. And there, in the corner, almost invisible, the ghost of a signature half erased beneath the paint. Lewis said it looked like an R. I thought it looked like a confession. We walked back through the quad in silence. Snow had begun to collect on the iron railings, muting the city's edges. Somewhere, a choir rehearsed unseen, their voices rising and dissolving into the night. I told Lewis to find Bracknell's article on the portrait and to ask the librarian whether any paintings had been moved recently. He nodded, his boots crunching softly. At the gate, I looked back. Through a lit window on the second floor, the portrait gleamed faintly, as if the painted eyes followed movement across the courtyard. That night, over a solitary whiskey, I opened the Times crossword again. The clue that had troubled me yesterday. Unfaithful likeness conceals one's true reflection. 8. Resolved itself with sudden precision. Portrait. It was, after all, too neat, too right. And yet, I underlined it twice, uncertain why the word felt less like an answer than a warning. I went to bed thinking that art, like truth, was only ever finished by accident. I've always found that the smell of a college library alters with the hour. In the morning it is all paper and polish. By evening it acquires a faintly ecclesiastical tone, dust and regret, lit by lamps too old to be trusted. St. Cuthbert's library was no exception. Its silence was almost arrogant, as if the books themselves disapproved of the living. Lewis waited by the desk, restless as always, the sound of his shifting feet absorbed into the carpet. We had been told that Dr. Bracknell's papers were being catalogued for donation to the university, a modest gesture for a modest life. Yet something about that struck me as incongruous. Bracknell had been a possessive man. I'd seen it in his room, in the precise arrangement of pens, the way his books were grouped not alphabetically, but by affection. Men like that do not bequeath their thoughts to others easily. The librarian, a pale woman in her 60s, led us to a reading alcove at the far end. She spoke in the flat tone of someone for whom loss had become administrative. Dr. Bracknell, she said, had reserved a carrel near the theology section, preferring its light. She opened the small drawer built into the table. Inside were his spectacles, a few penciled notes, and a folded page from the Burlington Review. Nothing, she added, of any significance. Lewis, dutiful as ever, began noting down titles from the shelf beside us. I ran a hand along the spines. All art history, predictable in their obsessions. Turner, Reynolds, Ruskin, The Moral Weight of Beauty. One book came away too, easily. Behind it, a thin envelope had slipped between the wood and the plaster. It was unsealed, the paper faintly yellowed, as though kept close to warmth too long. Inside was a single typed page, addressed to L. No date, no signature. The message was brief, almost hurried. Some truths are too delicate for exposure. The sitter's identity must remain concealed. You understand, of course. Silence is the kindest restoration. I read it twice, then a third time, each repetition deepening rather than clarifying its meaning. The phrasing was peculiar. the mixture of intimacy and admonition that suggests both guilt and affection. Lewis looked over my shoulder and asked who L might be. Bracknell's first name began with an L, I reminded him, though I doubted he was the recipient. The letter sounded written to him, not by him. The librarian peered at it, unimpressed. Could be from a student, she said, or a colleague about an article. Her indifference was almost persuasive, but the language, sitter, restoration, concealment, belonged to art, not academia. Someone was speaking of a portrait. I asked whether Bracknell had stored any correspondence or manuscripts elsewhere. She said she believed he kept a locked drawer in his rooms, but the bursar had already seen to that. The implication was clear. I was late, as usual. Outside, in the corridor, Lewis said he'd have the typeface checked. An old Remington by the look of it. I said he might, though I doubted that would lead anywhere. The letter had the intimacy of something written not on impulse, but on memory. One doesn't find that in machines. As we stepped into the quadrangle, the snow began again, softer now, fine as dust. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke. I told Lewis to look into Dr. Evelyn Clare, the woman the bursar had mentioned. If anyone had reason to speak of portraits and concealment, it would be her. He raised an eyebrow at my certainty. I said only that certain phrases stay lodged in the mind long after their origin fades. The sitter's identity, for instance, or silence is the kindest restoration. They sounded less like caution than confession. That evening, I sat alone with the letter spread out under my lamp. The type was uneven, a faint misalignment in the capital S, the mark of an older machine. But it was the rhythm of the words that stayed with me. Whoever wrote them had known both art and shame. The final line, "Silence is the kindest restoration," had the cadenced fatalism of someone who believed it. I thought of Bracknell's portrait, the woman's unreadable gaze, the varnish glistening like frost. Perhaps, I thought, concealment was not merely the theme of the painting, but its purpose. Before I turned in, I glanced again at the crossword still lying open from the night before. Keeper of secrets found within silent restoration. 6. The answer came too quickly this time. Motive. I poured a small whiskey, let it rest against the lamplight, and watched as the snow outside thickened into stillness. There are moments, I've learned, when a case begins not with evidence but with a single line that refuses to leave the room. This was one of them. There are rooms in Oxford where silence seems to have been cultivated, like ivy, over centuries. The kind of silence that grows thick, alive, and faintly resentful of disturbance. Dr. Bracknell's rooms were of that sort. Even empty, they seemed to remember him too well. Lewis and I returned late that afternoon, the snow having stiffened into a brittle crust along the window-sills. The porter, with a conspiratorial air, had provided us the key, remarking that the dean would prefer no further unpleasantness. I didn't ask what kind he meant. Oxford's unpleasantnesses tend to come in degrees of reputation rather than blood. Inside, the air was dry and faintly chemical, a mixture of varnish, turpentine, and solitude. Books, arranged with obsessive neatness, formed a perimeter around the desk, which itself was curiously bare, save for a single cup ring staining the blotter and a closed envelope marked private. It had been opened already. Lewis checked the drawers, finding nothing but stationery, a bottle of ink, and an unfinished crossword from the previous week's Times. I noted the clues he had solved. Forgery, muse, blind spot. Words chosen, perhaps, not by chance. The portrait of Lady Agnes Valery had been removed. In its place, the bare rectangle of wall where it once hung looked indecent, like a body missing a limb. Only a thin outline of darker paint marked its ghost. The bursar had claimed it was sent to the Ashmolean for safekeeping, though I suspected he wished merely to remove a reminder. I sat in the chair Bracknell must have occupied nightly, its cushion still faintly indented, and wondered how a life of study could narrow so elegantly into isolation. From the window, I could see the quad, students walking in pairs, their laughter muffled by scarves and distance. I envied them their ignorance of how easily beauty turns conspirator. Lewis asked what I expected to find. I told him, without quite meaning to, that I was listening. He frowned, used to tangible answers. But sometimes the dead, I said, leave their intentions in the arrangement of space. Books closest to hand, dust disturbed, a paper misaligned by hesitation, all of it part of the same unspoken sentence. He knelt by a low shelf, reading the spines. Ruskin, Pater, Brown, Freud. He remarked that the Freud seemed out of place. I said only that it seldom was. Beneath it, he found a notebook, unlabeled, bound in cracked leather. Inside, sketches of the Valerie portrait. Dozens of them. The same face again and again, altered subtly in expression. The eyes shaded darker, the mouth softening, the tilt of the head shifting almost imperceptibly toward modernity. The final sketch bore a single annotation in pencil. Repainted truth. There was also a torn page, the edge feathered where something had been ripped away. Lewis thought it meaningless. I thought otherwise. Torn pages rarely conceal trivia. The dean appeared at the doorway. Tall, immaculate, her composure studied. She seemed unsurprised to find us there, though displeased by the intrusion. Her voice carried that precise blend of courtesy and rebuke Oxford teaches its survivors. Dr. Bracknell, she said, had lately been troubled. Overwork, perhaps. She mentioned a difference of opinion with Dr. Clare about certain interpretations. A polite word, I thought, for betrayal. I asked if she had seen him the evening before he died. Her eyes drifted to the desk. No, she said, but she had heard a door close around midnight, the one leading to the garden stair. The porter's logbook, I remembered, had recorded no entry past 11. It seemed Bracknell had left and returned unseen. When she departed, her perfume lingered, faintly floral, masking the sharper scent of anxiety. Lewis, watching her retreat, said she seemed calm enough. I said calmness is often the sound guilt makes when it knows it has no witnesses. Before leaving, I stood once more at the window. Snow had begun again, delicate as dust on glass. The courtyard lamps trembled in the wind. A fragment of the torn page caught my attention. It had fallen behind the radiator, folded once. I reached for it carefully. Only a few words remained, typed and incomplete. Identity. Preservation of. Her likeness must not be known. I slid it into my pocket, saying nothing. Lewis had already gone ahead, his boots echoing down the stairwell. The sound was swallowed by the corridor's old hush, that steady, breathing silence peculiar to Oxford's walls. The silence of rooms that hold, too carefully, the things never said aloud. That night, alone in my flat, I unfolded the fragment again. The paper smelled faintly of linseed and regret. On my desk lay the crossword Bracknell had left unsolved. One clue caught my eye. Unspoken truth disguised by absence. 5. I filled it in slowly. Ghost. And for the first time that evening I thought I might be right. There are certain conversations one recalls, not because of what was said, but because of what should have been impossible within them. That afternoon with Evelyn Clare was like that. A dialogue conducted in half-truths, its real content hovering somewhere just beyond the reach of language. The snow had eased into rain by the time I reached the faculty building, each step leaving a small, wet declaration on the stone floor of the corridor. Her door was ajar. Inside, the air carried that faint blend of damp wool, cigarette ash, and paper that always seems to accompany lives lived too closely with ideas. She was bent over her desk, annotating a text with the nervous precision of someone who mistrusts the past, yet cannot stop courting it. She greeted me with a politeness that had nothing to do with welcome. She said she'd already spoken to the bursar, to the dean, and to the police report, as though I were merely another administrative echo of tragedy. I told her I'd only come to return something. I set the letter from the library on her desk, watching her eyes flick toward it with a hesitation that betrayed familiarity. She touched the edge of the paper as though confirming a pulse. I mentioned the words, "The sitter's identity must remain concealed," and her expression altered, not to surprise, but to recognition. She said Bracknell had been obsessed with old secrets, that the Valeri portrait was nothing but a metaphor he'd mistaken for confession. I said metaphors rarely provoke violence. She did not reply, only looked past me toward the window where the rain was cutting blurred lines across the glass. When she spoke again, her tone had softened, though her words had not. Bracknell, she said, had been searching for himself in the faces he studied. Every painting a mirror, every sitter an alibi. I asked if she considered herself one of those mirrors. She smiled, the weary smile of someone accustomed to being misunderstood, and said that she had once believed he saw her clearly, until she learned how often admiration disguises curiosity. There was a pause then, the kind that grows heavy, not with silence, but with the faint sound of truth shifting its weight. I asked if she knew of the restoration, the repainting. Her hand, resting on the desk, tightened just slightly. She said the portrait had been retouched months ago, before the term began. Bracknell had overseen it. I told her I had reason to believe otherwise. She asked what reason, and I told her the varnish was modern, the pigment traceable to a supplier in London, dated barely 6 weeks before his death. She looked at me then, not with fear, but with the dull fatigue of recognition. There was something she had already decided not to say. I asked, quietly, what Bracknell had found beneath the paint. She said nothing, but her eyes moved to a book open on her desk, a volume of Donne's poetry, annotated in her own hand. I saw a line underlined twice. No man is an island entire of itself, and beside it, in the margin, a faint addition written in pencil, and every woman a shore to be crossed. I told her I didn't recall Donne writing that. She said perhaps he should have. It was a curious remark, careless, almost defiant. Yet it struck me with the precision of an arrow. I remembered Bracknell's notebook, the same misquoted line scribbled beneath a sketch of Lady Agnes Valery. The connection, thin as breath, was enough. The words had passed between them before, an intimacy disguised as scholarship. I asked, lightly, whether she had been close to him. She replied that closeness was a misleading word. It suggested knowledge. And knowledge, she said, had been the one thing Bracknell never granted. He had written, she continued, as though discovery were an act of affection. I asked if she thought his discoveries dangerous. She said only that truth was always fatal to something. I thanked her and left. The corridor outside was dim, the rain whispering against the windows like a question repeated without answer. As I stepped out into the quad, I noticed the college gardener sweeping away the slush, his broom pushing small rivers into the drains. The sound was rhythmic, almost deliberate, the sort of ordinary persistence that holds the world together while it quietly decays. Later that night, alone in my flat, I poured myself a whiskey and opened my crossword. One clue caught my attention. Poet altered line concealing truth beneath affection. 8. The answer emerged before I could think better of it. Donne. I wrote it down, and for reasons I couldn't name, I found myself smiling, not at the cleverness of it, but at its melancholy accuracy. Donne, indeed. The poet who made love sound like theology and guilt sound like grace. Outside, the rain had turned to sleet, and Oxford once again hid itself behind its own reflection. It was Lewis who found the envelope, slipped beneath the windscreen wiper of the Jaguar as we left the station that afternoon. A heavy cream card, thick enough to suggest importance. Inside, an invitation, engraved with the faint formality of academia. The Master and Fellows of St. Cuthbert's request the pleasure of your company at high table this Thursday evening. No sender's name, no note, only the college seal pressed faintly into wax, the kind of invitation that conceals more than it offers. Lewis thought it a gesture of gratitude, an attempt to keep things civil after Bracknell's death. I told him that Oxford rarely does civility without calculation. By Thursday, the snow had hardened into glassy remnants along the gutters, and the air carried the scent of thaw. Wet leaves, old brick, and something faintly metallic. The college hall was aglow with chandeliers, that peculiar marriage of grandeur and decay Oxford manages so well. Long tables stretched beneath portraits of benefactors, whose eyes seemed to follow the living with tired disdain. The dinner began, as such things do, in ceremony. Latin grace murmured into indifference, cutlery gleaming in precise formation, wine poured with ecclesiastical care. The Master, a florid man with a talent for verbosity, spoke of continuity through loss. His tone suggested a man rehearsing consolation rather than feeling it. Evelyn Clare sat 2 places away, her profile turned slightly toward the window, the candlelight tracing the pale curve of her cheek. She looked neither bereaved nor guilty, merely absent, as if already beyond whatever verdict the room had prepared. I was seated beside the bursar, whose tweed seemed woven from discomfort itself. Between sips of port, he spoke of college finances, of endowments and deficits. Then, with a suddenness that betrayed the thought's rehearsed nature, he remarked that the Valerie portrait had been removed for the good of preservation. I asked whether preservation was always synonymous with concealment. He blinked, smiled thinly, and said some things in Oxford were better kept in the dark, lest light show the cracks. When the main course arrived, venison overdone, conversation resumed its carefully orchestrated murmur. It was then that I noticed the folded envelope beside my glass. I had not seen it placed there. No name, only a small wax seal, the same as before. I slipped it into my pocket unnoticed, feeling the faint tremor of curiosity one associates less with intrigue than with memory. A moment later, the lights flickered. A collective pause, a breath held in discomfort. Then, darkness. Somewhere, a glass shattered. The hum of conversation dissolved into confusion. When the emergency lamps stuttered to life, the room had changed. The Master stood frowning. Servants moved with the solemnity of stage hands, and at my place, the envelope was gone. Only the faint smear of wax remained on the linen. Lewis, practical as ever, later suggested it was mischief. Some undergraduate prank, perhaps. But Oxford's mischiefs, I told him, are rarely juvenile. They are acts of preservation disguised as jokes. Back in my flat that night, I poured myself a whiskey and replayed the scene in my mind. The placement of the envelope, the brief extinguishing of light, the symmetry of disappearance. Not coincidence, I thought, but choreography. Someone had wished to deliver and retract the same message, a gesture intended not to inform but to remind. I recalled then the bursar's phrase, better kept in the dark, and wondered whether he had meant it as warning or invitation. On my desk lay Bracknell's old notebook, still open where I'd left it. The final page, the one marked Repainted Truth, had a faint indentation, the trace of something once written above and torn away. I held the paper to the lamplight, the shadow of words emerging just enough to tease meaning. Not her likeness, but her confession. The implication unsettled me more than I cared to admit. a confession disguised as art, a painting not of admiration, but of exposure. And someone, Bracknell, Clare, or another entirely, had sought to silence that exposure with varnish and deceit. I poured another measure and turned to the crossword, though my thoughts refused alignment. One clue read, "Hidden message within, erased invitation 7." I let the pencil hover before writing secrecy, then changed it to absence. In the end, I left the grid unfinished. Some puzzles, I reminded myself, resist completion by design. Through the window, Oxford's lamps trembled in the mist like thoughts reluctant to extinguish. And I found myself wondering, not for the first time, whether truth, when finally revealed, is ever grateful to be seen. There are days in Oxford when even the light seems uncertain of itself. Too pale to be trusted, too brief to matter. The morning after the dinner, I found the city half erased beneath a crust of old snow, its rooftops glimmering like thoughts one had meant to forget. From my window, the spires looked almost weightless against the thin winter sky. Somewhere in the distance, bells were ringing out of time with each other, a discord that suited the day's mood. Lewis arrived early, carrying that particular brand of cheer reserved for those who have slept soundly. He'd been to the coroner's office, he said, and the report confirmed what we already suspected. Bracknell had died not from a fall, but from a blow. The instrument, blunt, narrow, and smooth, could have been anything from a candlestick to a wine bottle. Lewis, being practical, leaned toward the latter. I, being less so, considered the former. Violence is rarely improvised. It borrows from familiarity. We went first to the bursar. He looked smaller in daylight, his tweed jacket sagging like tired upholstery. His account was unchanged. Bracknell, troubled but sober, working late, alone. Yet he could not hide a flicker when I asked about the portrait's removal. He claimed it was at the Ashmolean, as before, but his hesitation was timed a fraction too long. A man can lie with words easily enough. It is silence that betrays him. From there we walked to the college archive, where an elderly assistant in fingerless gloves permitted us a look through Bracknell's catalogue of art acquisitions. It was meticulous. Dates, donors, valuations, all in neat columns, except for one entry, recently altered. The Valéry portrait's provenance, once listed as private collection, Yorkshire, 1821, had been crossed out and replaced with source unknown. The change was dated 3 weeks before his death, initialed simply L.B. Lewis thought it meaningless bureaucracy. I thought otherwise. A man who edits his own truths rarely does so from habit. Outside, the snow began again. Dry, wind-blown flakes that swirled through the quadrangle like paper scraps from a forgotten letter. Evelyn Clare passed us there, her coat dark against the white. She stopped just long enough to say she'd been summoned to the dean's office, then added, too lightly, that the college seemed determined to turn grief into paperwork. Her eyes were shadowed, her voice drained of irony. I asked whether she still believed Bracknell's death to be an accident. She looked away and said that Oxford was built on accidents, some recorded, some painted over. Then she left. Lewis watched her go, muttering something about the difficulty of women who read poetry. I said nothing, but her remark, painted over, clung to me like the damp smell of the snow. We spent the afternoon tracing Bracknell's last known movements. The porter recalled seeing him at 11, carrying a folder and humming under his breath. No one saw him after that, yet a student, nervous, earnest, claimed to have heard voices from Bracknell's rooms near midnight, a man's and a woman's. He had dismissed it as quarrel or lecture, which in Oxford often amount to the same thing. By dusk, the snow had turned to sleet. We stopped at the King's Arms for warmth, though neither of us spoke much. Lewis recited the facts in that patient way of his, each detail polished by repetition. When he was done, I asked him to read me the list again, but backwards. He looked puzzled, but did it. The dinner, the portrait, the note, the fall, the letter. Reversed, the story sounded less like a sequence of events and more like an argument collapsing inward. Somewhere in that inversion, something clicked. Bracknell's folder. The porter had mentioned it, but it had never been found. Not in his rooms, not in the archives. A missing folder, trivial perhaps, unless it contained proof. I told Lewis to find out if the Ashmolean had, in fact, received the Valerie portrait. He nodded, uneasy, then asked what I thought we were chasing. I said we were following shadows, and that shadows, by nature, are always attached to something real. Later that night, I walked alone through the quad, the lamps casting pale circles on the snow. My breath rose in brief ghosts. Somewhere behind me, a door shut softly, though no one followed. I stopped by the chapel steps, where the snow had been disturbed. 2 sets of prints crossing, then diverging. One deep and certain, the other lighter, almost hesitant. I crouched, tracing the lighter set with my glove. They led toward Bracknell's stair. At their end, a single dark stain bled through the whiteness. Wine, perhaps. Or something that had once been mistaken for it. When I rose, the bells began again, out of time, out of tune. Oxford, murmuring to itself in riddles, and in that moment I thought how easily truth hides. Not in darkness, but in the faintest suggestion of light upon snow. There are moments in an investigation when clarity arrives, not with revelation, but with discomfort. Like a note struck just off pitch that lingers too long in the air. The following morning carried that sort of unease. Oxford lay under a thin mist that turned every sound into a half-whisper. Even the footsteps along the cobbles seemed reluctant to declare themselves. Lewis and I walked toward the Ashmolean, the snow now reduced to a fragile crust along the gutters. He was uncharacteristically silent, though his silence never lasted long. He said he'd spoken to the museum registrar. They had no record of receiving the Valerie portrait. I said I had suspected as much. He asked where it was then, and I told him, nowhere honest. The museum's curator, a brisk woman with the voice of a school mistress and the patience of a saint, received us with visible reluctance. Bracknell had been, she said, an enthusiastic amateur, though more confident in speculation than in scholarship. She smiled thinly as she said it, as though rehearsing a phrase she'd used before. The college had sent no paintings to the Ashmolean, she confirmed. Not recently. When I asked if Bracknell had visited her in the weeks before his death, she hesitated. Once, perhaps twice. He had wanted to examine the pigment samples from their restoration archives. Zinc white, she remembered. I asked if he had mentioned why. She shrugged, said something about a paper on forgery techniques. Zinc white. The faint residue I had found near his desk. That ghost of powder that had clung to the fibers of the carpet. Lewis caught my expression and said I looked as though I'd found a clue. I said no, only a question. Clues are tidy things. Questions rarely are. We left the museum and crossed the street to a small cafe whose windows steamed with the smell of burnt coffee. The morning light had taken on that muted quality peculiar to January, the kind that makes even conversation feel subdued. I told Lewis to find out whether the bursar's late wife, the one who'd studied restoration in Florence, had ever worked for the college after her return. He said he would. I did not tell him why it mattered. It was not yet clear to me. In truth, I'd begun to suspect that Bracknell's fatal discovery had less to do with art than with ownership, and with the peculiar way Oxford treats both. Paintings, reputations, marriages, all restored, revarnished, reframed, until they show only what people wish to see. That afternoon, I returned to St. Cuthbert's alone. The porter, ever discreet, let me into Bracknell's rooms without remark. The air had gone stale, heavy with the scent of dust and something faintly chemical. I moved toward the wall where the portrait had hung, the square of clean paint still visible against the darker tone surrounding it. On the floor beneath, I noticed a faint trail of smudges, tiny specks of white, almost imperceptible against the carpet. I crouched, ran a finger along one of them, and found it dry, brittle, chalky. Pigment again, though less pure this time. Mixed, adulterated. On the desk lay Bracknell's notebook where I had left it. I turned to the final page, the one headed Repainted Truth. In the margin, a single phrase had been added in pencil, faint and hurried. Under the hand lies the hand before. I read it twice, then again, hearing in it less the voice of a scholar than of a man afraid of what he had uncovered. As I stood, the door opened behind me. The bursar. His expression was a study in restraint. He said he'd been told I was revisiting the scene and he thought it prudent to accompany me. I told him he needn't trouble himself. The dead rarely move things about. He ignored that and stepped closer, his gaze following mine to the wall. Curious, he said, how a painting could change so much in light. I said the light had changed nothing, only revealed the wrong brush stroke. He asked what I meant. I told him I'd seen the restoration notes. The work had been done using pigment, sourced in London only months ago. Not Bracknell's doing then, but someone else's. Someone who feared what the original would expose. His face remained composed, but there was a tremor in the hand that adjusted his cufflink. He said softly that I was mistaken. I said softly that I hoped I was. After he left, I remained for some time, staring at that blank square of wall. The silence felt less like emptiness and more like resistance, as though the room itself were unwilling to yield what it knew. That night at home, I poured a whiskey and opened the crossword. Restorer's error reveals hidden layer. 5. I wrote truth, then erased it, uncertain. The word seemed too confident. Outside, the fog had returned, turning the city into a charcoal drawing smudged by careless hands. I watched it for a while and thought how easily beauty disguises deceit. A single brush stroke out of place, a pigment too bright, a truth too carefully mended. And for the first time, I wondered whether this case was about a murder at all, or about the slow, inevitable art of concealment. It was the sort of morning that punished sound. Snow had fallen again in the night, the heavy, muffling kind that turns every movement into trespass. I remember the quiet most vividly, the way Oxford seemed to hold its breath, as though aware that some final utterance was about to be spoken, and wished not to interrupt. Lewis had gone to fetch the bursar for questioning, though I doubted we'd find him cooperative. There is a particular calm that settles on those who know their story must soon collapse. Not panic, but a kind of inwardness, as though rehearsing defeat. I left the car near Magdalen Bridge and walked, the river beneath a thin crust of ice. The air was sharp, faintly metallic. Ahead, I saw a figure standing alone by the railing, overcoat dark against the white. And for a moment I thought it might be Lewis. But as I drew nearer, I saw the shoulders were too narrow, the stance too composed. The bursar turned slightly, snow catching in his graying hair. He greeted me without surprise, as though he'd known I would find him there. He spoke first. A statement, not a question. You've discovered it, then? I said I had discovered many things, though few of them fit neatly together. He smiled at that, the faintest crease of irony. Oxford, he said, was never fond of neatness. We walked a little along the path, our breath forming small ghosts that dissolved before we could step through them. He talked in fragments, as men do when the truth has grown too large to hold in one piece. Bracknell, he said, had been close to the truth. Too close. He'd found discrepancies in the college's accounts, valuations, acquisitions, restoration invoices that no one had expected him to examine. The portrait was the beginning. Its forgery had been meant as rescue, not deceit. The college was drowning in debt. They had planned to sell one or two of their lesser works, discreetly replaced with skilled reproductions. It was, he said, an old tradition dressed as necessity. I asked who painted the forgery. He didn't answer, though his silence drew a shape around the name. His late wife, of course, the restorer from Florence. I told him the pigment had betrayed her, not her hand. He nodded, as if relieved that it had at least been artistry, not incompetence that exposed her. Bracknell had found out, not through the ledgers, but through love, or something resembling it. He had admired her work, admired her, perhaps. And when she died, he began re-examining the restorations she'd done. He saw the small things only love makes visible, the brush stroke too tender, the hue too alive. He realized the painting he cherished was not the one it claimed to be. The bursar leaned on the railing, his gloves whitening with frost. He said he'd begged Bracknell to keep silent, for the college, for her memory. But Bracknell had refused. Not out of malice, he insisted, but from the conviction that truth, once recognized, demanded exposure. The phrase had the ring of scripture about it, something Bracknell would have believed. I asked what happened next, though by then I already knew. A quarrel in the stairwell, he said. Bracknell had turned to leave. I reached for him, to stop him, nothing more. His voice faltered. He slipped. I thought I could still save him, but he fell before I could decide what saving meant. There was no sound, only the brush of cloth against stone. He looked at me then, not pleading, merely tired. You'll have to tell them, he said. I asked whether he wanted me to. He didn't answer. He turned back toward the river, and for a moment I thought he might step onto the ice. But he only brushed the snow from the railing as though clearing space for a final thought, and said softly that Oxford keeps its secrets best when they are half-confessed. When I looked away, perhaps only for a second, he was gone. The river carried no trace of him. Only the snow preserved the shape of his absence. Lewis arrived a few minutes later, breathless and indignant. I told him we were finished for now. He asked what the bursar had said. I told him little of it, only that guilt, like art, is a matter of shading. He frowned, not understanding, but did not press. That evening, as I wrote my report, the phrase returned. The brush stroke too tender, the hue too alive. I poured a whiskey and let the words settle. Some crimes, I thought, begin not with greed but with devotion, and end, as most things do in Oxford, beneath a layer of snow, perfectly still, perfectly quiet, until spring finds the color underneath. There are nights when the city seems to fold in on itself, when even the colleges appear to listen, their windows dimmed, their courtyards emptied of sound. That night, Oxford lay under a thin veil of snow, the air brittle as porcelain. I remember thinking how quiet guilt can make a place, how even the wind passing through the cloisters seemed to lower its voice. Bracknell's rooms had been cleared, though not yet claimed. His few possessions had been gathered into boxes, labeled in the clerk's indifferent hand. I found myself there again, not from duty, but from the persistence of thought, that peculiar itch of something unresolved, not in law but in meaning. Lewis had gone home hours earlier, exhausted and muttering about the paperwork to come. I'd promised to follow. I had not meant it. The fire had long since died. I lit the desk lamp, its yellow circle falling across the empty wall where the portrait had once hung. It was strange, standing before absence, the impression of weight without form. The bursar's confession, if that was what it had been, had tied the case neatly enough for the record books. Yet I could not help feeling that something had eluded us, some faint thread left hanging. On the table lay a folder marked Valerie Restoration, Notes. I had seen it before, but not properly read it. The pages were filled with sketches, pigment tests, spectral analyses, the ordinary debris of scholarship. But tucked between two sheets was a single photograph, the portrait before restoration. Lady Agnes Valerie's eyes in this earlier version were darker, almost defiant. The background, I hadn't noticed before, held the faint outline of another figure, half erased as if brushed away. A woman's shape turned slightly toward the viewer. I leaned closer, the line of the jaw, the set of the mouth, unmistakable. Evelyn Clare. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough for the radiator to tick itself into silence. Long enough to realize that the truth had not been hidden beneath varnish, but within it. That Bracknell had not merely uncovered a fraud, but a confession far more personal. The portrait had been retouched by the bursar's wife, yes, but the likeness she had layered into its paint was no accident. Evelyn Clare had been the subject she preserved, the ghost she immortalized in another's skin. Bracknell had seen it. Perhaps he had understood before anyone else that every act of restoration is also an act of betrayal. That to reveal one image, another must be buried. I thought of Clare then. Her composure, her guarded sorrow, the way her eyes had flickered at the mention of the restoration. She had known what Bracknell had discovered. Perhaps she had even helped him to find it, or perhaps she had simply watched him drown in his own devotion to the truth. I heard the clock strike midnight. The sound trembled faintly against the walls, as though the room itself disapproved of my intrusion. I poured myself a measure of the claret left from the bursar's sideboard. It had soured in the cold, its bitterness oddly fitting. From my coat pocket, I drew the fragment of paper I'd found weeks earlier, the torn corner from Bracknell's notes. The ink had faded, but under the lamp's low hum, the words grew legible enough. Her likeness must not be known. The handwriting was not his. I thought then of the bursar's wife, her art, her concealment, her husband's devotion. Perhaps the forgery had begun as an act of love, a wife immortalizing her own reflection through another, a husband protecting her secret from a world too cruel to understand the sentiment. And then Bracknell had recognized the face beneath the lie, the woman who had sat beside him in the library quoting Donne, unaware she had already been painted centuries before. The tragedy, if one could call it that, was not in the murder, but in the symmetry of it all. Two men bound by a woman who had never truly belonged to either. One preserving her likeness, the other exposing it. And in between them, the portrait, silent, complicit, eternally watching. I finished the claret and closed the file. Outside, the snow fell with a precision that felt almost rehearsed, each flake erasing the city's outlines until even gilt seemed ornamental. I switched off the lamp and stood by the window. The quad below was empty, the footprints from earlier already fading into anonymity. Lewis would ask in the morning whether I believed the bursar's account. I would tell him yes. Because in the language of police reports, belief is measured by completion, but privately, I knew better. The portrait had lied, but so had everyone who had touched it, including me. There was a moment, just before I left, when I thought I heard something. The faintest crack, like paint contracting in cold air. I turned, half expecting to see movement on the wall, the suggestion of a face re-emerging from beneath its cover. But there was only shadow, and the soft hiss of the radiator coming back to life. I locked the door behind me, and as I stepped into the snow, the wind lifted the flakes into brief, spiraling eddies, a kind of vanishing act performed by the weather itself. I watched them for a while, until the world settled again into quiet, and in that quiet I understood. Truth, like art, survives not by accuracy, but by endurance. It waits beneath the brushstroke, patient and invisible, until someone careless enough comes looking for it.